It doesn't matter where in the world you go, if you visit a mine, there will always be some kind of water problem. It just depends on what that is. We actually need minerals to go into all of the green technologies that we need for the energy transition. Local communities, and especially Indigenous communities or rights holders, they're often the ones that are left with the legacies from mining. Engineers, I feel so strongly, are incredible change makers. I think trying to consider how we can mine and process the critical minerals we need without creating those environmental legacies, like that is probably top of my list of the big challenges for the mining sector into the future.
That is Nadja Kunz, Associate Professor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia, Canada. Nadja has both a chemical engineering and business background and has been studying the issues of water management in the mining industry from a holistic and multidisciplinary angle. She is on a mission to resolve complex challenges around mining, including critical minerals, legacies, and fostering water stewardship. She actively partners with industry, government, and First Nations organizations in her work to deliver tangible outputs and risk assessment tools. My name is Peter Marcus Bach, and this is the Grand Challenges Podcast, a show about inspiring individuals who are stepping up to tackle the global challenges that our world is facing in their own unique ways. We reflect on the many out-of-the-box ways our guests have navigated the complexity and intricacies of the environment at the cutting edges of science, engineering, technology, and design. On today's show, Nadja and I uncover the role and importance of water management in the mining industry, looking at how water is used and is encountered in mining operations, and how a transition from management to stewardship can help companies be prepared for an uncertain future. We discuss critical minerals, mining legacies, and their impact on local and indigenous communities, and how catastrophic failures can be avoided with better practices and better stakeholder involvement. Detailed information is provided in the show notes over at peterandbach.com/podcast. Thank you for joining us today, and please enjoy the show. Welcome to the show, Nadja.
Hi, thanks a lot, Peter. It's great to be here.
Multi-continental, just referring to a previous episode on the podcast. You're based in Canada, and I'm here in Switzerland. Well, you're That's in Vancouver, right. To be exact.
Indeed. And I should also add, because it's important here in Canada, especially to acknowledge I'm on the traditional and ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam Nation here in UBC.
Very, very nice. Actually, I should look that up for Switzerland because it's always interested me living in Australia and how it's acknowledged at the start of many events and shows. So I'm going to have to look that up. That's going to be interesting. But nevertheless, Vancouver, we also have a connection to Australia because that's where we met. And you're basically you've lived in both places and you currently are dealing with mountains versus beach. What's your preference there? Because Canada is very, very beautiful in terms of the landscape, and Australia, especially in Queensland, where you did your studies, where you started your career, is very famous for beaches.
That's right. Well, I'm very lucky because I think I've had a career that's been able to take me to some pretty beautiful corners of the world. So Australia, amazing beaches, like you say. I spent a couple of years in Zurich as well. I was actually born in Zurich. I love the mountains, and I think that's a part of who I am, is mountains. So Vancouver's been an incredible place because we have mountains and beach. So it's a pretty nice spot.
No, even better. Flexible. Yeah, I'm a beach person. All in all, growing up in Asia, I guess you have to go on holidays to the beach. But also, you're definitely more outdoorsy than me. And one of your favorite pastimes is rock climbing. Something that I did in high school and then realized very quickly that, well, I think I'm better at belaying, so helping the climber climb by managing the rope rather than being a few meters up above the ground where I start to feel nervous.
Well, belaying is very important, so don't underestimate the value of a good belayer.
Yeah, but you've been engaging in that quite actively across the world, right?
Yeah, I've been very lucky to get to climb in some amazing places, and I love it. I find it I guess I got into it actually during my PhD when I was looking for things to balance my academic pursuits. And it I think what I love about climbing is I really love being outdoors. I love being in nature, but I also enjoy the challenge and the problem solving that comes with climbing, especially when you're doing some really long outdoor climbs. It's just very tranquil. I find it very relaxing and almost meditative in some ways. It's really peaceful.
It's very interesting the way you put it because, I remember as soon as I'm at least a meter or a meter and a half above the ground, I start to feel extra focused, but also quite nervous. So, that meditative feeling is something I never got from it, but definitely interesting to hear your insights there. Do you have any tips for overcoming the fear of heights?
So I personally don't have a huge fear of heights. I definitely have gone through lots of periods of having a fear of falling, especially when you're lead climbing and the consequences of falling are high. If you're doing something that you find a little bit challenging, the fear of falling is always there. So I think it also has taught me a lot about mindset and about having confidence in myself and picking your battles in some ways, picking the climb, but knowing what your limits are and working within that limit. And I think I suppose I can carry that on to other ways I try to approach life generally, but I do find with climbing, as I said, it's sometimes I know I have the physical ability to do it, but if my mind tells me I can't, I know I won't do it. So it's very much this, even if, again, just trying to get that mindset to be confident in your abilities, I think it's a good lesson there.
I guess it's really good mental training.
Absolutely.
They say golf is also good mental training because it's all in your mind when you cannot hit the ball, but I dare not compare those two. Although you can play good golf in Queensland as well, from what I've heard.
That's true. Well, it's all the same concept. It's all about that believing you can do something has a lot to do with whether or not you'll succeed.
Yeah. And so Queensland is where we met, actually all the way back in 2012. And you actually played a very important role in my career, believe it or not. And that was that you made. Yeah, I don't say that lightly because in thinking back, all these years, I spent time in Australia and I'm in Switzerland now. But to get to Switzerland, you were the person who actually helped me make the first contact with the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology because you were there at the time for some period of your career. So yeah, thanks for being that bridge. And, it's opened up my mind about the world and also about my research career and how I journeyed along that path.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, thanks for that, Peter. And I'll just make a quick comment on it because I actually take enormous pride in helping connect people. My mum always used to joke that I was the network queen when I was younger. I always have enjoyed meeting people. Even my PhD research actually was looking at social networks as part of the work and the importance of central people in communicating about water and sustainability issues. And so I do take great pride in help support people make connections. And so it's very rare that you get to hear that those connections made such a big difference. So it's really rewarding for me to hear that that was so helpful for you at that time.
No, definitely. And so, I keep referring to this, but yeah, we met in 2012 and this was an event actually in Queensland, and it was sort of a gathering of different PhD students across the G8 universities and the C9 as they call it in China. So it was a little exchange program, but very quickly we saw amongst all of us just how similar our topics are and how important, I guess, holistic thinking and thinking beyond the technical solutions has become. And this foreshadows a bit of some of the topics that we want to get into. But at the time, you were doing your PhD at the University of Queensland and in the topic of water, but not the water that I've covered on the show actually quite extensively before. Could you tell me a bit about what you were researching at the time?
Yeah, so my PhD work was focused in the area of water management issues in the mining sector. I had spent some time in industry and I really saw challenges in getting systemic management of water issues at the mine site level. And so I went to do a PhD and focus on that topic. I worked between the Sustainable Minerals Institute at UQ as well as the business school. And my background is in both disciplines in engineering and business. So my research work was focused on developing mathematical models to look at the water-related risks that would be faced at a particular mine site, but also mapping out the social networks around how people communicate about water-related issues and really highlighting that there were gaps in communication between teams, between departments, between management levels, and linking that with how those communication gaps could also impede water management issues. So I really enjoyed my PhD. I know that that's an unusual thing sometimes for people to say. There's certainly ups and downs in it, but it was a very holistic, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary PhD, and it really created in me an enormous desire to continue pursuing work that was at the boundaries of disciplines and also very focused on water-related issues in the mining sector, which I've kind of continued working on because the topic is so extensive that I feel like there's always a lot of room to grow. So it's been something that's kept me interested and motivated for quite some years now.
And water and mining, you don't often think too much about where the water is used in the mines as someone looking at the stories around the mines. Usually it's about digging the ground and trying to get precious minerals, metals, and other kinds of resources out of the ground. But water actually plays a very significant role there and can have quite far-reaching consequences if not managed properly. But before we get into that, and we've had a few mining episodes before on the show, so it's really nice to add this element to the collection that we have. But you did a double degree in business and in chemical engineering prior to embarking on your PhD. And it's something that I think that's quite unique to Australia, being able to study for a few years longer, but actually finish off with two very different disciplines. And so what motivated the choice to go for both at the same time, rather than, say, doing chemical engineering first and then maybe doing a master's in business and administration?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I know that that's what some of my classmates did. They just did the core chem eng and then they went back and studied other disciplinary expertise later. For me, I guess I chose that at that time in my life. I was quite sure that I was going to go into industry. I didn't necessarily know I wanted to go into mining when I started my undergraduate degree, but I was very interested in how large industry has such a big impact on the environment. And so I knew that that was a space I wanted to work in, but I also felt quite early on, I guess, in my studies that the best way to change things was to be in positions of leadership. And so I've always aspired to be somewhere where I can have change and impact and make the world a better place, really, was what's motivated me since I was much younger. And so for me, the business degree was an opportunity to grow into leadership positions. And I think as a young engineer, I thought that I would do that through joining a company and then working my way up into positions of leadership. My pathway ended up taking a different turn, which I can share later. But I also, when I think about actually doing the degree and what I gained through having both degrees at once, I think as engineers, we're not always trained to write as well as we could. And so
that is so true.
I still think I can learn to write better. I don't believe I'm the best writer in the world, but I do think that the way of thinking that I learned through my business degree and the way of writing was very different. And that taught me a lot of valuable skills. So both in terms of how I would approach problems and problem solving, it is a very different approach in the business discipline to what you have in engineering. And so most of my degree, in the early years, I had 3 engineering subjects and 1 business subject. And it was a very nice balance. I feel that I gained really nice complementary skills throughout the learning process.
And you raise a very important point there. I think it's very important for people to realize that when you study things, you're not just studying the knowledge itself, you're actually learning a way of thinking. And I guess you would say, on the engineering side, it's more the problem-solving, critical thinking skills, but sort of based on technology, based on how we can make things work. So really the fundamental physics and chemistry and maths around it. Whereas in the business side, it's really more the people skills, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And I've always been a people person. So for me, taking subjects on leadership and organizations and human resources and economics, those things were very complementary. And I guess when I reflect on it, I probably continue to draw a lot of those kind of skills in the type of research work that I do as well.
You wanted to fulfill the network queen prophecy.
That's right.
Which I think has worked really well. At least, I can definitely support that. So, yeah. So you finished your double degree, as they call it. It has a good ring to it, I must say. Maybe I should have done one in 2007 and then decided to then work your way up a big company, and you actually joined Rio Tinto Alcan.
Yeah, that's right.
What was the story there?
I mean, I was an extremely lucky undergraduate student in engineering because it was at a time when the industry was really looking for lots of people. So in my undergraduate degree, I managed to get summer jobs every year with a company. So by the time I'd graduated from engineering, I had experience across a lot of different industries. I'd worked as an undergraduate student in oil refining, in pulp and paper, in fertilizer production, and I'd had a couple of opportunities to work in mining vacation placements as well. So when I finished, I guess it was also a time where there were a lot of job opportunities, and I decided to join Rio Tinto because I really wanted to earn my stripes, as it said. I wanted to get out to the field, to do something real and be on the ground. And I spent some time working as a process control engineer in the Yarwun Alumina Refinery in Gladstone in Queensland. And I mean, I had a great team. I really had a great experience, but I was somebody that was so motivated to see change and work on something to make the industry better. I think I had almost too much enthusiasm to stay in the role that I was in the sense that I decided I really wanted to go work on water and mining issues. And then I felt that the PhD was the pathway for me to become an expert in that space. And that's what led me back to pursue the PhD.
And so it was also happening during the mining boom that Australia was experiencing. Listeners, if you want to know more about it, I also talked to Mark Swinnerton on episode 46 about it in detail and his experience there. But yeah, I guess that opened up a lot of opportunities, particularly in that sector. And you've had a diversity of experience as well. I mean, oil refinery and paper and pulp mill, it's night and day. I mean, yeah, you could sort of, I was about to say they were dry and wet, but I think they're both wet in the process, although the final product looks different.
But the similarity there, Peter, is that as chemical engineers, we're always interested in processes. And so the commonality across those different industries, even though they seem different, is chemical engineering is such an incredible base for working across so many things, because it's really about understanding the system, optimizing the system, understanding the process. So that's what I actually really love about being a chemical engineer and having trained in that discipline. And I would also say, in addition to the mining boom you mentioned, there was something else very significant going on around that time, which was that we were in the millennium drought period. And so even the periods that I had working in all those different companies, I was often, looking for opportunities to work on water issues. So in the pulp and paper, I worked for Visi Paper for my undergrad thesis, and I looked at reducing water use within the paper making process. And likewise, when I was at BP, I was interested in, how water was used and discharged in oil refining. And so I always found myself very drawn to the topic of water. And some of that was probably that environmental angle of my interests, but also the time that we were in with there being such a shortage of water across Australia broadly, actually.
Major events really shaping your interests. But I feel like if you live in Australia, you're just automatically interested in water, at least. So many examples of that, and also of guests we've had on the show before as well, that believe that water is essential to making a lot of other things work as well. Without water, there cannot be good processes. Vegetation cannot survive. Mines, as we'll find out later on, will also rely on water as well for many of the processes. So, yeah. And so 2013, you finished the PhD and you had somehow solidified now your knowledge really across business, across water, across mining. And so what steps did you take after that? Yeah,
so I was looking at where I was going to go next. I think there's been a few moments in my career where I've been at a bit of a crossroads. Do I take the academic path or the non-academic path, and which field do I go in? And so I decided that I would pursue a postdoc, and I was looking at opportunities, particularly to come to Europe. And I really wanted to go to Switzerland because I was born in Zurich but left when I was 6 months old. So I have a family connection to Switzerland, and I really wanted to have the opportunity to live there. So I knew of IAVAG. I knew it had a great reputation, and I was able to make connections to be able to pursue an opportunity for a postdoc there. So I feel very lucky that I had that chance. I worked with Janet Herring, who was the director of IAVAG at the time, and Karen Ingold, who runs the political and environmental governance group within IAVAG. At least she did at that time when I was there.
Keeping the interdisciplinary aspect and also really the institutional aspects around water front and center of the topics that you were interested in pursuing.
Absolutely. And for me, even though I've always been very drawn to mining, I just think it's such a big industry where there's enormous opportunity to have impact, because it's a big sector, certainly for Australia and Canada. But it was a great opportunity for me to be at IAVAG because I was working more on urban water questions. And so for me, it was just an opportunity to be stepping outside of the mining topic and gaining skills also in some other areas, which I think is very important for researchers to do.
No, definitely. I think if you learn from other disciplines and other areas, I think you can find new ways to apply it to your own. And so with that skill set, you then embarked on yet another chapter before you got to where you are now, which is actually with the World Bank. And just looking at your journey, you worked in the International Finance Corporation. So it felt like almost you had too much of water and you needed to do something on the business side. Was that what was going through your head at the time?
It's interesting. When I was living in Switzerland, one of the things I really loved about it, being in a different way from Australia, is how central Switzerland is. And I was very eager when I was there to make connections with lots of international organizations and work very actively in making those kinds of connections. And I was very lucky that I, again, through my networking personality, happened to meet the right people, and I managed to get my CV in the hands of someone who did at that time run the advisory group within the International Finance Corporation. And I never would have necessarily imagined a role for myself within IFC. But for me, it was extremely exciting because I have always had an interest in development generally. And so the opportunity that I had when I joined IFC was as a water specialist within their team. IFC is a significant investor in a lot of projects, private sector projects, the largest source of multilateral finance globally, I believe. And so they are investors in projects, and that's a very powerful position to be in.
Oh, yeah.
And so IFC does have a partial investment in the Oyu Tolgoi mine in Mongolia. And that was actually the opportunity when I was working with IFC. I was a consultant working on a project in Mongolia where we were looking at supporting mines within that region to improve their water management practices. So
I think on one of our email exchanges during that period, and I think it was when I asked you to connect me to Ervak, you were telling me about a trip to Mongolia. So it was actually for that. I thought, I want to go to Mongolia one day because I've tried their food before, their cuisine. It's amazing. And I'd love to see one of these traditional Mongolian tents. I mean, they look so cool, very big and round. I'll have to put a picture in the show notes. But what was that experience like?
It was incredible. I guess it was over a 3-year period or so that I was traveling to Mongolia 3 to 4 times a year to work actively with companies, training them on water balances and water accounting, and really just encouraging exchange of knowledge. What was also very nice about it was we were working across the environment and social teams at the mine sites. So for somebody being interdisciplinary, that was exciting. And it felt a very familiar context in the sense that Australia and Mongolia are both very water scarce places. Mongolia is even more water scarce than Australia, at least the Gobi Desert is. That there's certainly more water abundant areas of Mongolia, but where a lot of the mines are in the South Gobi, it is extremely water scarce. And so groundwater is the main water source for a lot of projects. And with that comes a lot of associated social challenges as well for traditional nomadic herders in the area.
I can imagine, when groundwater is your only source and everyone relies on that, then, you got to be careful with how much you extract and I guess how you allocate it and how you manage it, especially the quality as well. So
that's right.
Yeah. So we've traced your steps so far from university in Australia into industry, back to university, then to Switzerland, then to the World Bank, which brought you to Mongolia, but you're in Canada now. So what's that final piece of the journey thus far that you have taken, and how did that come about?
So I had an incredible experience working with IFC. It was such an important, pivotal part of my career, actually. I still think very fondly of the time I've spent in the field and the opportunity to have real impact. There was a job that was advertised at UBC, and I thought to myself, if I'm ever going to follow an academic path, this is absolutely the job for me. It was actually the only academic position I applied for at that point in my career.
Oh, okay.
So I certainly could have taken a different path that would have probably kept me a lot more in the world of multilateral finance. But the job opportunity at UBC was really, I would say, my dream job. I've been based here between 2 departments, the Institute for Mining Engineering and the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs.
Oh, wow, that's the perfect intersection for you.
It is half engineering and half in the School of Arts or the Faculty of Arts. Yeah, and they really wanted somebody that was able to bridge disciplines. And it was also a position that had been created at a time where there was a group at UBC working on development projects around the mining sector. So for me, it really was the perfect fit. And I was very grateful and lucky that when I applied, I was offered the position. And I've just had the most incredible experience, especially in the early days at UBC. I had the opportunity to go back to Mongolia with some work through other professors in the university, but also we were working working on projects around improving environmental governance in Peru and Ethiopia as well. So I really had an incredible opportunity to learn about the mining sector in many different places, as well as being, of course, based in Canada, where I have had it has a very different context to a lot of the other places where I've worked. So I can share a little more about that and why it's so important, particularly when we talk about water issues.
I think that's definitely an interesting topic that we can get into. So we know that you're active in the mining sector and really looking at it also from the governance side, the policy side, and with a focus on water. But you've seen how it works in Australia, Canada. You've had also exposure to other countries. I guess comparing Australia and Canada, two countries where this practice is very big and you see lots of mines and often you find it a lot in the news. But how do they compare?
Yeah, I mean, I find it so fascinating because I grew up and had an early career focused on a very water scarce environment, or one that is a variable climate. So Australia has wet and dry periods, and sometimes floods can also be very problematic for mines. There are very significant cases of that. But in Canada, the problem is overwhelmingly much more often one of water abundance, where mines are operating in areas that have higher rainfall. You also have snow and cold climate, which creates additional challenges for water management. And that's what's really kept my job so interesting for all this time, is because you go to a different place. And I tell this to my students, I say, it doesn't matter where in the world you go, if you visit a mine, there will always be some kind of water problem. It just depends on what that is. There's, whether it's a scarcity issue, a water abundance issue, community concerns, and often the community concerns exist regardless of climate. But it is an interesting field because it's so diverse. Even though the topic may seem at face value quite narrow, it's actually a very, very complex topic, water and mining.
I guess when you start looking at the environmental factors that you have to deal with to make sure the operation runs smoothly, then you're dealing with two very different kinds of locations. And I said this in 2012 when we did this event together with all the other students, but I seem to always find parallels across our different research areas. I mean, we have the same issue in blue-green infrastructures, where as soon as I came to Switzerland, snow was a thing and de-icing salts was a thing. And I thought, well, I've never had to deal with that. Let's look into it. So certainly very interesting contexts. And an example, I think, that you mentioned in one of your papers as well, when you start looking at Asia and Indonesia, for example, you get 5 meters of rainfall a year, and that has a whole range of other challenges to deal with.
Absolutely.
So,
And I mean, I don't know the numbers for Australia, but I did see a very interesting paper some years ago from a company here in Canada who they'd done some estimates of how much water they were using or managing at their site relative to how much ore they were processing. And it was in the order of 15 times more water that was being moved relative to what they were actually trying to process. So just to, I suppose the scale of it is, and was the point of the paper that they wrote for this conference, was that mining companies, especially in water abundant areas, they're not just in the business of mining, they are in the business of water management. Actually, they're more, in terms of volume, they're dealing with more water than what they are.
Oh, wow.
Ore. So it is a very significant issue for the sector.
And so I guess maybe illustrate that for me now. So when we think of mines and water security and water management generally, because water security is, of course, a global concern. But where do we start looking? What are some of the interactions? Just to, I guess, shed some light on it. I mean, where do we use water in mines? And then what are the concerns that are coming out from them?
Yeah, so water is used within the extraction and processing of ore. So we dig rock out of the ground, we grind it up into tiny pieces, and then we put it through a processing circuit to recover the minerals that we want to recover. And so we use water in all different parts of that process. So within mining itself, you can imagine that when you're digging in the dirt, it gets very dusty. So you need to use water to suppress the dust. If we don't suppress the dust, it has health and safety issues for workers. It can impact local communities. So it is really important that we have water to keep the dust manageable. And mines also span across very large geographical areas. So it's not a tiny hole in the ground, that can be quite substantive sizes. And so the dust issue is a very real one. And then as you move into the processing circuit, a lot of mining processing relies on flotation, where we're adding water together with that fine ground up rock particles that we've made into small pieces. We put water into the process circuit and we use flotation through chemistry to separate the minerals that we want, which float to the top, and the minerals we don't want go to the bottom. After we've done that, we have to dewater the ore that we've taken out. We also need to remove water from the waste stream of the process circuit, which is what ends up in the tailings dam. And so that's kind of how that flow moves through the mining process itself.
So I guess several elements where it's really about adding water first, because I guess for health and safety reasons, and dare not walk through a dust storm, whether it's in a factory or in a mine or somewhere in the desert, but you use that to try and subdue it. Then in the whole process itself of adding water to try and extract what you need. And actually, we had a very similar discussion on a previous episode with Don Weatherby about hydrometallurgy, where they tried to use a more chemical process to get metals back from catalytic converters. So I guess similar to that, where you have to use water to try and extract what you need. And then it comes out wet, so you have to get rid of the water because you need the particles in the end, or the minerals that you want in the end. So yeah, a bit of a lengthy process. Seems like a lot of involvement of water, and then a lot to deal with at the end with the waste. One element or one keyword that often comes up as well is acid mine drainage or acid rock drainage, where you've got water involved yet again.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. And, acid rock drainage is one of several kinds of legacy issues that the sector can pose on water. There are so many interactions that can be closure issues. So many closure issues associated with the mining sector are very often water related. And I think the other thing is I've explained why water is needed as an input to the process, but there are certainly lots of sites where you're actually dealing with too much water. And so you've often got enough water that you want. The issue is actually trying to avoid that water from getting to places where it's going to cause issues. So whether that be in an underground mine where you don't want to have water flooding into the underground mine and causing health and safety issues. And likewise, when we think about the closure of projects, if we've got waste rock dumps or tailings dams and we've got lots of water that's moving through the environment, that can also result in contaminants being mobilized and then moving into the environment. So they're things that absolutely need to be actively managed within mining. And acid rock drainage is something very specific that we can actually have. There are places in the world that do have naturally occurring acid rock drainage, but mining, because we're separating rock into smaller pieces and we're actually exposing sulfide minerals to air and water, in some cases, that then is what leads to acid rock drainage. So they're the kinds of chemical reactions we need to manage by being very mindful of where we put waste rock, how we manage tailings, making sure that we're not creating these kinds of legacy issues for the sector.
And that often also sort of results from other processes that are even simpler and also cause problems. We mentioned flooding and groundwater just now. And I guess imagining if your mining operation is actually trying to reach, I guess, an ore deposit that is below the groundwater table, you're going to have to deal with that water.
Yeah.
And you don't see it until you dig it up, usually. I mean, you can figure out that it's there, but to what extent it really interferes with the operations, I mean, it's something to be expected, to be planned for. Floods as well. I guess if your operation floods, it's kind of lies flat for a few days until the water's pumped out or until it subsides.
That's right. And anything that takes time can be very costly, especially in large industries like mining.
No, definitely. And this is an issue that you've tried to look at very holistically. Also, a recent paper that you wrote about it really highlights a lot of these challenges, and that I guess one problem or one solution can create problems elsewhere as well. So it's kind of cascading. I mean, how are mining companies dealing with this, and is it sufficient? Do we need to change the way the practice of dealing with water currently looks like in the mining sector?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think that's why it's such an interesting active research area is, what can we do differently to extract the minerals that we need for the future while leaving minimal environmental legacies? It is a challenge. I think in terms of what the sector can do differently, there are already things the industry has improved on. And I think it's certainly I've seen in my career, when I think back to my time as an undergraduate student, where a lot of mines at that time, and I did some research work as well during my undergrad time, it was a period where a lot of mines didn't even account for water or have a good water balance in terms of knowing how much they were using at all. So, there's been significant advances in making sure sites and organizations that work across the industry, like the ICMM, that's a large industry group, they have worked with the sector to improve voluntary standards and improve corporate reporting and accounting around water. But there's also been, I see that even shifting just in the time that I've been here in Canada, more stringency in regulations as well around environmental discharge, and the policy and regulatory space plays an enormously important role in helping to improve and move the sector forwards. But I think it's really exciting because there are groups that maybe you may not necessarily consider to be really big change makers in influencing the industry, which have come to be very significant actors in recent years, which is the community piece. So communities, and certainly here in Canada, First Nations or Indigenous communities generally are very impacted by a lot of the sector.
Because ultimately the operation doesn't just impact what the company is doing at the site. There are much further reaching consequences if even the slightest thing goes wrong. And, it's environmental destruction or destruction of cultural heritage as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, so local communities and especially Indigenous communities or rights holders that may have the rights to the land itself, they're often the ones that are left with the legacies from mining. So it is absolutely important that they're front and center in decisions about the industry and its expansion. And investors have also become a very important voice for influencing the industry in recent years.
No, definitely. And I think in a way, this is what you talk about in this paper, and you call it inbound and outbound risks. And ultimately, there are certain risks that can be managed internally, but they will create external consequence, which then in turn create problems for the mining operation. So it's all connected at the end. Hence, it makes sense to look at the whole picture.
And I mean, as a company and a business, of course, the interest of the mining company is going to be first and foremost around managing their internal risks. So I think that lens is very important and helpful for the industry to be motivated to manage broader impacts that it has. But when we talk about risk and water-related risk, it also depends on whose perspective one takes. So to a community, the risk of a project is very different from the perspective of a company, for example.
Yeah, I guess there's trickiness in trying to be objective about the whole situation because it is a perspective question. And how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think about this all the time, especially in terms of how I set up my research program and who I partner with. And I do work really hard to have relationships and partnerships with different kinds of actors within the mining ecosystem. So I do have projects and research interests where I work directly with Indigenous communities and First Nations. And I also have some projects that are funded by the industry, have worked also with investors. And of course, being in a policy school, I regularly interact with regulators. So I really enjoy that. And I think as researchers, it's really important that we have those different perspectives influencing the kind of work that we do. I strive to be objective, but of course, that's an aspiration and everyone will have a different perspective of what that looks like for them, I think.
No, definitely. But you're moving away from what we call water management now to a term which I actually thought was very nice, and it's called water stewardship. I've seen that term pop up a lot in the blue-green infrastructure space because if we can harness more stewardship, then I think, we can bring the stakeholders together and we can actually manage the systems more, I guess, keyword, holistically. But what do you define as water stewardship and how is it different from, I guess, the traditional management? Is it that internal, external? Is it that holistic view?
I think for me, it is about that internal, external. And I'll say for me that because lots of people ask me about what is water stewardship, and I think there's still some, I think people struggle with the term water stewardship still. What does it look like? What does it mean? And I think that's because for me, the big difference between management and stewardship is really the community piece. And so as water professionals, often we're very technically trained. It's about managing water flows, making sure there's no discharge. It's very focused on technically optimizing and managing within an operation. As soon as you start thinking about the outbound risks and impacts, all of a sudden it's actually the social skills that are very important. It's that community relation piece. It's, what you do at the site, maybe rather than just assuming that you know what needs to be optimized, you actually need to start first by asking the local community around what their goals and aspirations are, and then design and manage your water to be mindful of that broader impact. It's as much about a mindset shift in terms of the system boundary that you're thinking about, but also the skill set you need to have good water stewardship people within a mining company, I think is very different from what you need to have good water managers.
And I guess it's not just building confidence in the decisions you make as a manager or in the technical aspect, but in building confidence in everyone involved that could be affected, that what you want to do makes sense.
Absolutely. That's right.
Yeah. So lots of interesting ways we can evolve the practice. And I think it's very interesting to see how you've been really engaging with many different stakeholders, especially in the Canadian context. And what is pressing in Canada at the moment in terms of mining?
Well, right now, Canada has a national Canadian critical minerals strategy, which was released a couple of years ago. And so there is an enormous emphasis on expanding the mining sector to meet the critical minerals needs that we have both domestically and globally. And I guess linked to that, and actually this trend of having a critical minerals strategy exists also in a number of other countries. Australia has one as well. The EU also has a critical minerals strategy. And this is certainly very important for ensuring supply security of those minerals.
So we've discussed this on previous episodes, but maybe for the listeners who are unfamiliar with this, define to me, what is a critical mineral and why is it important?
Yeah, so critical minerals are the minerals that we rely on for energy security primarily in terms of I hear this myth sometimes that, as we move towards renewable energy futures, we maybe don't need to mine as much, but that's not the case because we actually need minerals to go into all of the green technologies that we need for the energy transition. So we think about solar cells, wind farms, battery storage, distribution systems for decentralized energy, all of that relies heavily on minerals. And so the kinds of minerals that we need for that energy transition. Some of them are things we already mine. There's also lots of things that we maybe have not needed as much in the past that we're starting to move towards. And so critical minerals are things that have a variety of properties that are really important, whether that be being magnetic, being strong, conducting electricity, all of these things that we need for our renewable energy technologies.
And I guess it must be a headache sometimes to think about it, because as technology advances, you might find a new mineral that actually performs better than what has been used in, say, a solar panel. And then you have to go and figure out where to get it again, don't you?
Yeah, although, I actually would say it's almost the reverse, the way that things are evolving, in the sense that cobalt has been something that is only present in a small number of places, particularly in the Democratic Republic of Congo, has a large cobalt reserves, but very problematic in terms of access and also the ethics associated with extraction. So you're seeing this shift away from having as much cobalt in batteries, and we're seeing advances in the kinds of minerals that are used in battery technologies. So there is also this shift often where there are opportunities sometimes to substitute minerals or to become more efficient in how we're using minerals within these technologies. And so it's really important that there are large impacts of the mining sector. So it is absolutely important that we try to minimize how many metals we're using in our renewables. So all of that is a very, very important part of the overall picture.
Which is actually nice to know, because sometimes they say when you put constraints, then innovation happens much quicker because you have to work within them. Yep. And to take that perspective you just painted about cobalt, to take that more humanistic approach to understanding where do we source and what do we use, and whether it's sustainable or whether it makes sense ethically, I think is a very nice way of going about it. So yeah, very insightful. Absolutely. And it's opened my eyes on that. I thought it was the other way around, because people always strive to optimize technologies, try to build the next, best thing, the biggest tech, and the highest performing ones.
And I mean, there's definitely both, of course. We are seeing an enormous demand, for example, copper in particular, the amount of copper we need. Current projections from the International Energy Agency around how much copper is needed are very staggering. And pretty much every metal that you look at, the curve is just, exponentially rising if you look at what the demand projections are and what is anticipated to be demand into the future. So there is also an enormous push on being able to identify how on earth are we going to be able to produce that volume of metals into the future to meet those demand projections. And that is then what's driving innovation to find other sources where possible. Not everything can be substituted. And but this is part of what makes it a very exciting area to be in.
Definitely. Well, quite literally, how on earth? I mean, we haven't gone to the moon yet
That's right.
to mine there. So definitely
there are people thinking about it.
Yeah, true. I mean, you read sci-fi novels about it where they start mining the moons of Jupiter. So
it's not science fiction anymore. Mining oceans is also something that is another area of policy and technical challenges.
Wow. I'll have to look that up, because I can't imagine how you would. The pressures there must be enormous, and I guess the logistics. But thanks for that tip. I'll look it up. But critical minerals, and I guess back to Canada, now that we've sort of shed some light on what it is and why they're important. Canada, like every other country, needs to then source critical minerals for the industry. And so where are some of the problems we start encountering there when we have to try and look for where to find those minerals, given the resources the country has?
Yeah, well, I guess with mining, we've already mined the things that are easy to access. And so that means that in order to get more minerals that we need to dig further underground, and we need to mine resources that have what we call lower ore grades. So rather than being able to access minerals from the shallow part of the earth, we have to dig much deeper, and the amount of mineral that's within that rock is much smaller than what it was 20 years ago. And so that has enormous challenges because, and I heard a very good episode with Mohan, who was on your show. I can't remember which episode that was now, Peter, but I listened to that one recently.
All good.
And, he was talking about the fact that the valuable thing you want comes also with a lot of waste. And so as we mine lower grade ore deposits, it means in order to get the same amount of valuable mineral, unless we change something dramatically about the way we process and extract, we're going to end up with a considerable amount more waste associated with that. And so that creates larger legacy issues potentially in terms of how we manage those waste materials and where we store those, and the legacies associated with tailings and waste rock in particular.
I just had this interesting image come to my mind as an analogy to it. But I guess when you're trying to extract some ores, iron ore or some other ores, it's like looking for a pen in a box of pencils, and now you're looking for paper clips in the same box.
It's true.
And they usually are smaller, so they go all the way to the bottom. But I guess if I had to imagine it, it would be probably something like that. I guess, can you verify my analogy? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great analogy. And, it's harder. There's a lot more technical challenges associated with mining deeper as well, more uncertainty. For those that are motivated by those complexities, it is geotechnically a really interesting space to be working in terms of stability. There was actually an incident up in northern British Columbia just last week where there were 3 miners trapped underground for 60 hours because of some part of the underground mine being unstable. And that was, as you move into those underground projects, there is more uncertainty. Thankfully, they were safe. They were in one of the safety chambers that we have under those underground mines, and they were able to get water and food and everything and communication until they got out safely. But that's not always been the case with these kinds of projects. So they do come certainly with some risks.
Apart from the technical challenge, which I guess we'll somehow solve, there's a lot more of the governance challenge and also the broader implications of it. Because, critical minerals, I guess from the word critical, there's a sense of urgency to try and get a supply of these minerals. And oftentimes that means you would have to fast track a lot of projects, get a lot of permits approved in record time to try and go back into these sites.
Yeah, so I think, they're critical from the perspective of the national interest. And so that certainly is what has happened here in Canada. There are projects that have been, now starting to be promoted for fast tracking because they're in the national interest. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be supported at the local level where all the impact happens. And so that's a tension that we're seeing play out here in Canada. There is this push to fast track and move projects forward quickly through the permitting process. But that's been met with a lot of questions and concern at a local level, both from Indigenous groups and also those that are concerned about the environmental legacies of mining. What is the due diligence that's going to be done to make sure those local impacts are managed? And, does the local community or First Nations and rights holders, do they actually support that pace of development? Because they may not want the industry to develop quite that quickly. So I think there are absolutely some very interesting conversations and challenges that are affecting the sector right now here in Canada.
But are they bearing fruit? Is there progress being made, or is it still a resistance piece?
Yeah, I think there is no simple solution to how the industry should move forwards. There are demands for minerals that we have at national and international levels, but there are people that are affected at the local level. So there's no right solution to how to grapple with that conundrum. And it's what I find so interesting about working in this space is trying to think through, how the industry could be made more sustainable. It's certainly, there are still going to be cases where local communities and people will never support mining, and how does the government respect those rights, and to what extent do they respect those rights for communities to also veto projects? I think it's a very interesting time that we're in to see how things evolve, and hopefully to be able to support some kind of positive outcomes at the local level as well. There are certainly things that the industry can do much better locally. There are many long-term negative impacts that mining has had, and there are plenty of projects that have had very negative impacts, both from the social side and also environmental side.
Which has built up a bit of a stigma as a result of it, yeah.
That's right. And so understandably, communities do have that legitimate concern about the industry. Yeah, I think that it means that the most successful companies going forward are going to be those that are able to deliver local benefits and also do that in an economically efficient way. But that community piece is going to become absolutely more and more important as we move into the future.
No, indeed. And in a way, due diligence, a key word that I think has occupied your mind as well as defined one of your research themes, as well as the whole water aspect that we've discussed as well, which sort of brings us to one potential solution that you think is required for the way forward, which is to have the quantified evidence for decision makers as well as for the communities to see that, objectively, the impacts are going to be minimized or non-existent. And with that, you also have been delving into how we can develop certain types of tools. And in particular, one tool that I'd love to discuss is, and also relates to your work on tailings dam failures. And you mentioned tailing dams before, and I figured it's a very interesting aspect of an entire mining operation to go into because they often sit there for very long periods. And maybe we don't pay enough attention to them. There's a number of different elements in a mining operation, but the tailings dam is really where you store a lot of, I guess, call it the waste coming out of the ground once you've processed it. And so I guess you can think of these as giant lakes of mud, if you want to call it that. And you have to build a wall to sort of hold that back and keep it in place.
That's right. I mean, there are different ways to construct tailings dams. Sometimes it is about literally constructing a dam. I was actually surprised here in Canada, they do also sometimes use natural lakes where they dispose of tailings as well. Structurally, they're more stable than building a dam itself. But being someone that loves outdoor lakes, it kind of blew my mind that was a solution. But ultimately, I guess, and you're absolutely right to say the so-called waste, because there are also often minerals that have not been recovered but might still be useful for the future that were uneconomic. So it's uneconomic minerals. It's not necessarily waste. It's just at the time when they were mined, they weren't economic to extract. And so they really can be there. The plan is for them to often be there into perpetuity forever.
But every now and then, these dams can also fail, and often the consequences are quite catastrophic. And
that's right.
You've had some studies where you've highlighted a few key examples. I'm just citing the most recent one in January 2019 in Corrego do Feiao in Brazil. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but hopefully my Brazilian listeners can let me know. So the dam failed, left more than 270 people dead, irreversible environmental damage, and a $16 billion hit to investor portfolios. I mean, that's just one example. And then another one in 2015, Samarco mining complex, also in Brazil, 19 deaths, the largest environmental disaster in Brazil. I mean, these make massive headlines when they actually happen, but then often the consequences take decades, I guess, to, if at all, to undo or to sort of remediate. And so, I mean, why do they fail? And what are some of the issues there? Is it this due diligence, or is it, is it other aspects?
Yeah, I mean, these kinds of failures, I think, is characteristic of many kinds of engineering failures. It's very rarely one particular cause. There's always going to be multiple factors that lead to the failure of a complex kind of construction ultimately failing. But water is often one of the key issues that does arise in these kinds of failures. So because it is a wet slurry, it's wet rock really, and the rock doesn't settle out very easily out of the dam. So you always have a bit of moisture in there. So if there's too much water that gets in there into the tailings dam, and if it's not being managed well, there can be that liquefaction and then the dam failing as a result of that. Things like earthquakes can also be triggers. But, there's been a number of studies, and the area of geotechnical engineering is not my specialty, but, there are certainly papers that have been written really highlighting that we have a lot of the technical knowledge to design and manage these kinds of dams much better. But it's often about making sure we have good oversight and regulation around them. And, it's not just having the technical knowledge, it's actually having the right systems in place to manage them well. And so that's something that I think reflects on other kinds of disasters we can think about with engineered systems.
And I think oftentimes, if we neglect the asset management, the operation and maintenance, then I guess that disaster can ensue as a result of that.
That's right. And a lot of my research has looked at understanding what these legacies are, what could be the potential consequences of failure, and then how could you mitigate against those failures. But ultimately, a lot of my research is really also interested in how do we mine in a way where we're not even producing these kinds of dams. I think thinking about innovation and the question you also asked me earlier on in the episode around what could the industry do differently? I think trying to consider how we can mine and process the critical minerals we need without creating those environmental legacies, like that is probably top of my list of the big challenges for the mining sector into the future. I would love to see us not have tailings dams, not have waste rock dams, or at least be doing that in an integrated way where we're developing projects so that they won't have the same environmental consequences into the future.
Mining 2.0.
That's right.
At least the modern mine. But
indeed.
I guess we do have a lot of legacies around. And so we mentioned tools earlier, and related to that topic, that is actually one very interesting piece of work that you did trying to help manage the risk around these tailings dams. Could you tell me a bit about the modeling you did and the tool that you developed to help operators sort of manage the risk around tailings dam failures?
Yeah, so the project you're talking about is one that was led in collaboration with my PhD student, Sally Innes, who developed the model as part of her PhD research. And so really there are models that exist for mines to understand at the mine site level what the inundation area might be in the case of a failure. We wanted to develop tools that would support better understanding of risk at a more holistic level, at the regional scale, portfolio level. So if you're an asset manager, an investor that's got a large number of mines in your portfolio, or you're a mining company that's got a large number of projects, what is the cumulative risk that you have across all of those sites, and what does that look like? Or for regulators that are trying to audit these projects and they have a lot of mines in their portfolio, what is the kind of land that's at risk if there was failures of these kinds of structures? So that was the model we developed. There was a model that had been developed by the USGS for lahar flows, for modeling lahars and those kinds of rock avalanches.
I had to look it up. The lahar is literally defined as a mud flow from a mix of volcanic slurry and other aspects.
That's right. I didn't know what it was before I came to Canada either.
Not something you want to end up in the path of, but yeah.
Absolutely not. No, that's right. So yeah, we used that as a base, and then we recalibrated that for looking at tailings flows. And so that's some of the work we did to be able to develop models that would support better regional scale understanding of risk.
I guess it's a bit like flood modeling, where you try to model the flood extent, except you're not dealing with just water. You're dealing with a lahar or a tailings dam flow. And
much, much more difficult to estimate where it's going to flow. There are a lot of variables we do not have in our model that would be future work, and things that potentially are very hard to anticipate.
But what has the reception sort of been towards this kind of tool so far, and some of the other tools you've developed through your research?
Yeah, I think there's definitely interest in being able to have things that can support that better system level understanding of risk, and to understand where those intervention points would be in terms of not just at the site level, but having that more regional scale interest.
We see this from other disciplines as well. Famous quote, what gets measured gets managed. And tools, I guess, are really the first step, because they help you quantify it at a much faster rate. And I think the efficiency then allows you to embed that into the process of decision making.
And when we started that work through Sally's thesis, it was at a time where there'd been, as you say, these very significant and devastating failures of tailings dams. There's been more failures, by the way, since that 2019 study, but they haven't been as impactful on human life, thank goodness. But certainly there are failures that we see happen also in Canada. We've had tailings failures, and there's been a real interest, particularly from investors actually, in really pushing the industry to do better. And it's that push that has, I would say, driven a lot of improvements in standards, in terms of voluntary standards. And certainly at the national level, a lot of regulators also bringing in much more stringent rules around the design and management of tailings dams. So unfortunately, it's not uncommon that there needs to be a disaster for the industry to change. I would love to see the industry being more proactive to manage these kinds of risks without needing that stick. But I think that they do motivate change when those disasters happen.
But it seems you mentioned a very potentially powerful player, being the investors. And these are multi-billion-dollar businesses that, really supply a lot of the world's technology, the world's infrastructure, and as you mentioned, renewable energy examples as well. And I guess investors themselves, they may have a potential way to then influence it, or at least,
absolutely,
I guess, encourage more transparent reporting, more rigorous risk assessment, and I guess more holistic approaches to managing the operations.
Absolutely. I think those that are in the positions of influence and power, investors, members of boards, that's where change will happen, I think. The significant changes in terms of how these kinds of legacy issues like tailings are managed. One of the other things we found was through interviewing and doing some qualitative work, actually interviewing investors, was we found that although there'd been this real drive to transparency of understanding where tailings dams were, a lot of investors also didn't know what they were going to do with that kind of transparent data. So having tools to support understanding holistic risk is really important, because we can't expect investors to be experts in mining and understand all of the details. So you need to have tools that can help put risk quantification into words that will support better decisions and better influence from those investor groups. And so that's part of where we wanted to go with the Lahazi T model.
And it's really nice space that you found, and I guess a way where you can also transfer the new knowledge that you create into practice more readily.
Absolutely.
And certainly something I try to do as well in my own field.
Yeah, indeed.
So a mix of really the people side, the technical side, the policy, the culture. Where are you heading? What are your future plans? You told me you had an announcement to make as well on this show.
I do. Yeah. So the podcast is happening at exactly the right moment, because I have a new chapter in my career path now, which is that I've made a decision to move back home to Brisbane, Australia, which I still see as home for me. And I'm actually going to be going right back to my roots, which is where I studied my undergraduate degree in the School of Chemical Engineering at the University of Queensland. So it's kind of fun. It's almost been 20 years since I graduated. So it'll be really nice going back to a familiar place, but as a very different person, having had quite a range of experiences since I was an undergraduate student.
Congratulations on that. And it's amazing to see you come full circle, starting off at the University of Queensland and now doing a way back. And let's see if you do another loop around the world as well. I'm curious when we have you on for part 2. But that's exciting news. And I guess, what are some of your ambitions then in your new role?
Yeah, I'm actually really excited about being back in an engineering school where I can work closely with students that want to do a slight extension of their skills. So they have that strong technical base, but they want to connect to policy. They want to connect to business. They want that extra bow in their bonnet. What is it called? I don't know. Maybe there's a blooper for you. They want that extra something special to support their future ambitions. And I think we really need to train engineers to not be entirely deterministic in coming up with solutions. Engineers, I feel so strongly, are incredible change makers for the future. Industry is such a really important part of society. And so being able to support students to have a broader perspective when they're designing solutions, and being engineers that appreciate community values that might be a little outside of what they would normally optimize for, they're the kinds of skills I really want to teach students to have. And I'm really excited about being in a school that does have some research on mining, but also works in other fields. So, you spoke, Peter, about the value of being able to, learn from other sectors and other disciplines. And so I'm very excited about being able to work with colleagues that might have similar methodological approaches to me, but in a different application domain, and then being able to collaboratively work together on some new projects. So it'll be a lot of fun.
And with the world becoming so interconnected and all the topics now interrelating, I think you're well placed for that. And I think you're going to have a blast embarking on some new projects as well. Do go visit the beaches for me, please.
Oh, I will. I absolutely will. We're returning to Brisbane with 2 young children, so I think we'll be having plenty of time at the beach.
Plenty of opportunities.
Absolutely.
Nadja, it's been fascinating hearing your journey, really going from Australia all the way across continents to Canada, all the different aspects you've touched upon, just the interdisciplinarity of the work that you do in the mining sector, the relationship with water, as well as, the cultural community involvement. But like I do with every guest, I'd love to ask you some key questions so that listeners can get to know even more about you and, in a way, what drives you.
Sure.
So one aspect is innovation. And so in your view, what does the word innovation truly mean, and how has it shaped the way you approach challenges or opportunities in your work?
So for me, I still take my innovation lesson from one of my former PhD supervisors, Tim Castell, who is a professor in innovation. And he really emphasized on me that people think of innovation as a new idea, but it's actually not just having the idea. It's about implementing that idea and being able to move that idea forward. So for me, it's almost like breaking out of assumption of what innovation is and what it's not. So for me, innovation is not just the idea, it's making that idea work and being able to have the supporting systems around that.
Ideas look good on paper, but even better when they're acted upon, I would say.
Absolutely. That's right. There are plenty of examples, and probably a whole new episode of people that have had really great ideas that have not seen the light of day. So you think about electric cars, why did the internal combustion engine take off rather than electric cars? There are so many factors that influence whether an innovation sees the light of day or becomes mainstream.
And I guess the true innovators really stand up to that resistance and they push through and they find ways.
That's right. Yeah.
Actually, I see your point there. Yeah. It's acting is one thing, but acting it in a way that's effective is really the tricky part.
And I try to, I have a lot of ideas in my work too. So I'm always reminding myself that, Nadja, it's not just having the idea, it's actually doing something about it, writing that paper, getting stuff moving. So
no, definitely. But very good reminder for all of us with really bright ideas. Was there a key moment, book, person, or event that completely changed the course of your career or mindset? I mean, we've had several different chapters of your life, but was there a particular one?
I was thinking about this before our episode, and I think the person I would say that really influenced my career was a gentleman called Don McKee, who used to be the director of the Sustainable Minerals Institute when I was an undergraduate student. And I had never thought about pursuing a PhD. And it was really through a lunch conversation with him that part of a scholarship that I'd won, I had the opportunity to meet with him. And yeah, he suggested to me that I consider doing some research work within the Water Centre at the Sustainable Minerals Institute, where I worked with Professor Chris Moran, who later became my main PhD supervisor. And I just really realized how much influence we can have as researchers and what that opportunity is. So I'm very grateful to Don, if he's listening, for suggesting that I consider research as a pathway.
No, that's incredible. That was actually the missing link. I was thinking to myself, you really enjoyed the industry and then you came back to the research, but really that moment, I guess, would have pushed you to go for it.
Yeah.
And look where
and
we
also
are
working with Chris and Tim in my PhD, they were both incredible mentors, and I saw the influence that they had in their domains and really wanted to be a similar kind of person in the future. So I've had an incredible experience working with them also.
Beautiful. And so what tips and strategies can you offer in terms of time management? How do you maintain a balance between your professional and personal time?
Well, Peter, I was thinking you should have one of those episodes where you just talk about time management, piece together everyone's strategy, because I would love to know all of the best strategies for time management. As I mentioned a moment ago, my husband and I have 2 young children now who are under 4. One's just turned 4. So time management is very front and center. I try to protect my mornings very preciously. I find I'm most productive in the early part of my day. And so it's really about trying to have periods of time where you can have uninterrupted time and be able to concentrate. But I find I'm most innovative and most happy and creative when I'm also having meaningful breaks. And for me, that means going into nature. So having a weekend, making sure I'm actually taking a weekend and going out and exploring somewhere, that makes me feel refreshed at the start of the week. And I feel it's a part of time management that I think is actually really important.
I was going to say, being several meters above the ground as well, free climbing somewhere.
We don't get to do that as much with the 2 kiddos, but as soon as they're able to get on the wall, we'll have them there.
Teach them to belay at least. Well, when I learned it, they said weight didn't matter. It was just how you held the rope, so it should work,
I trust my 4-year-old for some things. Maybe not for belaying yet, but in time, absolutely.
Well, if you train them young, they'll be the experts. They can belay at the Olympics.
That's right.
But I do believe as well in protecting the spaces of time where you feel the most productive. I think it's different for everyone. Nowadays, they talk about chronotypes, identifying your chronotype. Some people work well in the mornings, others are night owls. I still am not sure if I've changed mine over the years. Sometimes I'm productive in the evenings, but I find mornings are really good times for focused work and entering, as they call it, flow states as well. So yeah. No, very nice tips. And so what is your favorite childhood memory?
I think for me, and this is probably also why I'm someone that is drawn to going back to Brisbane, is my best childhood memories. It sounds corny, but they're the ones like with my family, with my cousins, being around the extended family, having happy times together. It's about those experiences. I'm very much someone whose favorite memories are about the experiences. And so for me, it's the people and the places that are associated with that.
No, I think extended family always gives you a lot to reflect back on as well later in life, and you wish you can go back there, or if you're there you can just pop by and visit. I certainly have a lot of these experiences. Yeah. What was one of the most challenging situations that you've ever faced in your career to date, and how did you overcome it?
So for me, one of the most challenging things has been trying to make decisions at key moments in my career path around what I'm going to do next. I feel like when I look back on my career, everything feels like it was very logical. It flowed to get me to where I am now, and it looks very easy in many respects. But I had, enormous tension in many of those moments around, do I want to be in academe? And if so, what kind of job am I looking for? Which discipline do I fit in? Which department do I belong in? And really struggling a lot with being an interdisciplinary scholar who can now say I'm proud to define myself as someone that is that connector, that has a skill set in working across disciplines, but it's certainly not the easiest path to choose. And so I think for me, that is what I found most challenging. It's not a specific moment, but it's several moments I've had that have had a similar kind of scenario. And the way I overcame it really was, I'm somebody that does call on my mentors all the time. So for those mentors that are listening, thank you for hearing me out and being a sounding board as I grappled with these moments and choices. I am someone that needs to talk through decisions, but also being true to my own priorities. So when one goes to someone for advice, they will give you their opinion, but it's important to also know what are your objectives that you have at that moment in time, and that can also shift over time as well. So that's a long answer, Peter, but hopefully it's some insightful for some of your listeners.
But it's definitely an answer I personally can relate to as an interdisciplinary researcher myself. And I think, already early in my career when I finished my PhD, my intention was to go diverse and not to sit in an office and publish papers to no end. Yep. And, had I chosen publishing, I would have probably had more papers than I really was proud of. So I think, through that intentional decision, which wasn't easy at the time, you look back at it and you see where it's taken you. Even that one moment I told you to connect me to Ervag, that was life-changing. And in a way, it's not a linear path. Yeah. We've had this mentioned on the show before as well, that life's a journey, and you never know where you end up. But when you look back at it, you accept that it is non-linear. Then it's incredible what ends up happening. I mean, look at you. You've been across multiple continents now, so 3 continents with quite a few long stints in Mongolia. Still jealous about that. Definitely need to go.
I can definitely connect you with some lovely people. Mongolia
we'll chat after the show.
Indeed.
No, I think it's, I think it needs to be heard. And I hope that, many young professionals hear it and learn to, accept and just let life flow. And I think your story is one that really shows that you can be incredibly successful and you can accomplish a lot and have, such beautiful moments as well in your research career. And, from not knowing where to go in the first place, or from having that uncertainty. And
absolutely.
So, thanks for sharing that.
Of course.
Already some strong advice, but do you have any other advice that you can offer to young researchers starting out, especially in your discipline?
Yeah, I think it's, I suppose, 2 pieces of advice. One of them I did mention, which is consider what your own values are and what it is that drives you, and be true to that and listen to what it is that motivates you. We're all different, and that's great. It's important that we're all different, but that can also help you navigate choices in a way that's very mindful of what's important to you. And sometimes for me, there are periods in my life where that's been motivated by wanting to make the best career choice. And there are also moments in my life where I've been motivated by wanting to be in a particular location or be close to particular kinds of experiences that will be important for our family, for example. So those priorities can shift. And so it's worth being mindful of what those priorities are. And I think the second thing is for people that are working across disciplines, it is important that one is able to be what a good mentor of mine, a lady that unfortunately has passed now, the late Dee Bradshaw. She used to talk about the importance of being a good T graduate. So having the depth, but also the breadth. It's great to have breadth, and I have a lot of breadth, but you also need to be able to have knowledge in a particular area and have a skill set that really drives down that knowledge from a research perspective. So they would be the couple of pieces of wisdom I would share.
Very actionable as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we slowly draw to the end of the show, what would you most like to be remembered for?
I want to be remembered for the kind of person that I've been. So less about the achievements I've had and more about what I've been like as a colleague, as a mentor, the connections I might have made for people like yourself, Peter. You know, I appreciate people. Yeah, maybe not that I don't need to be known as the network queen, but I value, for me, the most enjoyable part of my job is really mentoring young people to find their path. Like, I love that about my work, and being able to support people in their growth and development. Like, that is actually what I want to be remembered for, is being able to be probably a good mentor and a good supervisor and colleague.
Beautiful. Where can people find you if they want to get in touch? Are you on social media?
I am. You can find me on LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest at the moment. I can be found at UBC right now, but I'll be transitioning over to the University of Queensland very soon. So that will be the next place to look for me. So LinkedIn is probably the most stable for the next several months as we make that transition.
And we'll definitely put that, as well as links to all the topics we discussed today, in the show notes, so that listeners can delve deeper into the world of water, mining, governance, and everything related to that. But Nadja, thank you so much for coming on to the show and for sharing your journey, and congratulations on the next chapter in your life. And I look forward to catching up when I'm overdue to come to Australia, but I look forward to catching up when I find the chance to get there, or when you're in Switzerland again.
Sounds great. I look forward to it also, Peter.
And like I do with every guest, I always give my guest the final message. So one last message for the listeners to take away from today.
So I think my key message is maybe in a couple of spaces. So being somebody that is in the mining space, and a lot of listeners may not actively be in mining, being mindful of your own interactions with the mineral sector, how you use and rely on minerals. We should all be knowledgeable about our dependence on minerals and how that is associated with different kinds of effects. So being mindful as consumers about what that impact is, I think. And then for those that are actively working more in the mining industry or affiliated sectors that have an influence on mining, is also using that position to make the world better and to minimize what those environmental legacies are. So if you're a mining engineer, you know, your role is really driven around maximizing revenue, also thinking about how you could mine better so that you're not leaving these same environmental legacies. That's probably my lasting final message for listeners.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Peter.
And that wraps up our global, exciting and multidisciplinary episode with Nadja Kunz. For tips on rock climbing and belaying, a recipe book on critical minerals for green tech, or an overview of the Canadian, Swiss and Australian beaches and mountains, check out the show notes for more information over at peterandbach.com/podcast. And as always, thank you listeners for tuning into this episode and for your feedback and support. If you are enjoying this show, I would be incredibly grateful if you could share this podcast with your family, friends, colleagues, and even fellow mountain climbers. Subscribe or follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, other podcast channels, or follow the LinkedIn group to stay up to date with the latest releases. If you're curious about me or my work in general, you can also check out my website or social media. Head to petermbach.com, my YouTube channel, Peter Marcus Bach, that's Marcus with a C, or follow me on X at Peter M. Bach or Instagram at petermbach87. Feel free to reach out to me with any feedback or guest suggestions so that I can keep improving this show. The podcast's intro and outro song is called Starsky by Alex Kieran. Stay tuned for our next episode and next guest to hear how they are tackling the grand challenges.